The Silent Watcher. I've lived alone for about a year now. I'm in a quiet, older apartment building. Nothing fancy, but it's close to my job. And I've always liked having my own space. I'm pretty introverted, so my evenings are usually spent reading, watching a movie, or just enjoying the silence. I don't get visitors often, and I keep to myself. I felt safe here, at least at first. Over time, though, I started feeling like something was off. It's hard to explain, but little things began to bother me. I'd come home and notice my keys weren't exactly where I thought I left them, or I'd find my phone charger unplugged when I swore I left it plugged in. It was small stuff, easy to brush off. I told myself I was just being forgetful, but looking back, I wonder if that's when it all started. One night, I heard a strange creaking noise. My apartment is old, so it wasn't unusual to hear it settling, but this noise felt different. I told myself I was being paranoid, but it was hard to shake that uneasy feeling. Then things got worse. A few nights later, I woke up to a soft scraping sound. It was almost like something was being dragged across the floor. It was so faint that I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But it kept happening, night after night, always in the middle of the night when everything was dead silent. I'd lie in bed holding my breath, listening, but I was too scared to check. I started noticing more things out of place. A kitchen drawer left slightly open, a photo frame tilted, my coat on the floor when I knew I hadn't dropped it. I tried to explain it all away, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was just tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to change the locks. I figured if someone had a key, that would stop them. For a couple of nights, everything seemed normal again. The apartment felt calm, and I started to relax. But that didn't last. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of movement. This time, it wasn't faint. It was clear, like someone was walking just outside my bedroom door. I froze, my heart racing, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. I stayed still, listening, until the sound stopped. I was too scared to get up and check. But in that moment, I knew. Someone had been in my apartment. I couldn't take it anymore. I bought a cheap security camera the next day and set it up in my living room, pointing toward the front door. I thought if I could just prove to myself that no one was there, I'd be able to sleep again. The first few nights, nothing happened. I felt a little silly, like maybe I had just been imagining it all. But then, one morning, I checked the footage. It showed me sleeping on the couch, completely undisturbed. But there, in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching me. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring. I must have watched that footage a dozen times, hoping I'd see something different, hoping it was a glitch. But it wasn't. It was real. I called the police. They came by, but there wasn't much they could do. No sign of forced entry, no physical evidence that anyone had been there. They told me it could have been a prank or a trick of the camera, but I knew. I knew someone had been in my apartment, watching me while I slept. I tried to keep living there, but I couldn't sleep. I was too scared to close my eyes, too scared to turn off the lights. One night, I stayed up, watching the camera feed live on my phone. Around 3 a.m., the figure appeared again, standing just outside the camera's view. This time, they moved. Just slightly, but enough for me to see them shifting in the shadows. That's when I realized they knew where the camera's blind spots were. They knew exactly how to stay just out of sight. That was the final straw. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and decided to crash at a friend's place. As I was getting ready to leave, there was a soft knock at the door. My heart dropped. It was so quiet, I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder this time. I stood frozen, my hand on the doorknob, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to open it. I was terrified of what might be on the other side. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the other side. I grabbed my phone and decided to leave through the back. Just as I opened the back door, I heard it, the sound of my front door opening. I didn't wait. I ran into the night, not stopping until I reached my friend's place. I've been staying with her ever since, but I can't stop thinking about what happened. I keep replaying the sound of the front door opening. I can't get the image of that shadowy figure out of my head. I thought I'd feel safe once I left the apartment, but the fear hasn't gone away. Even now, sitting here, I feel like I'm being watched. I keep the windows closed and the doors locked, but it doesn't help. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear that soft knock. Before I moved out, I left the camera recording one last time. A few days later, I checked the footage. There was nothing for hours, just an empty room. But then, in the middle of the night, the figure appeared again, walking through my empty apartment. I never went back. I've been meaning to post this for a while, but every time I sit down to write it, the memory of that night makes me stop. It's been months now, but it still haunts me. I don't even know if it'll make sense to anyone, but here goes. For context, I live alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I'm in my late 30s, and I've always enjoyed the solitude. My street is peaceful, especially at night. Hardly anyone is out past 10, and I can usually hear every little noise from my bedroom, the occasional barking dog or the rumble of a distant car. That night felt off from the start. I can't explain why, but something wasn't right. It was too quiet, like the air was heavy. I shrugged it off as paranoia. I told myself I was being ridiculous and went to bed around midnight. I lay there, trying to sleep, but the quiet was unsettling. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it, a knock at my front door. At first, I thought I imagined it. It was muffled, like whoever was knocking didn't want to be heard. I froze, my heart racing. Who would be at my door at this hour? I lay still, listening. A few seconds later, another knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I debated getting up. Maybe it was nothing, but what if it wasn't? My mind immediately jumped to the worst scenarios. Someone casing the house, a break-in about to happen. Then I heard a voice, faint but clear enough. "Please, help me." My stomach dropped. The voice was shaky, almost pleading. It was a man, and he sounded scared. I stayed in bed, not sure what to do. Every instinct I had screamed not to open the door. But what if he was telling the truth? What if he really needed help? The knocking continued, more frantic now. "Please, I've had an accident. I need help." I got out of bed and crept to the door. I didn't open it, but I listened closely. My hands were shaking as I peered through the peephole. I could see him, mid-30s maybe. He was pacing in front of my house, holding his head like he was hurt. It was hard to tell in the dim light, but he looked disoriented. I didn't know what to do. My brain was screaming not to trust him, but guilt tugged at me too. What if he was in a car crash? What if he really needed help and I was just standing here doing nothing? The knocking became more aggressive. He was practically slamming on the door now, shouting, "Please, I need help. My phone's dead. I don't know what to do." Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police, but part of me hesitated, still unsure. What if he was lying? What if it was some kind of setup? The desperation in his voice terrified me even more. He sounded frustrated, like he was losing hope. Before I could decide, I heard him slam on the door again. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. As I described the situation to the operator, something strange happened. The man stopped banging on the door. He stood there for a moment, then backed away, slowly. I watched through the peephole as he stepped into the middle of my yard, staring at my house. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I might pass out. I held my breath as he turned and started walking down the street, disappearing into the darkness. The operator kept asking if he was still there, but I couldn't speak. I just stood there, watching the empty street, trying to calm my racing heart. A few minutes later, I heard the distant sound of police sirens. The officers arrived quickly, their lights flashing across my front yard. I rushed to the door and explained everything. They searched the area, shining flashlights into the bushes up and down the street, but there was no sign of him. It was like he vanished. I stood there, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. The police assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood and advised me to lock all my doors and windows, which I did immediately. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was over, but the sense of unease wouldn't go away. I sat in the living room, the silence pressing in on me. Every little noise made me jump. I replayed the events over and over in my head, wondering if I'd made the right decision. What if he really needed help? But the way he just disappeared, it didn't sit right with me. Just as I started to relax, my phone rang. It was the police. They'd found a wrecked car a few blocks away. The front end was smashed, but here's the thing. There was no one inside. They couldn't find the driver. They said they'd keep looking, but for now, they had no idea where the man had gone. I barely slept that night, and honestly, I haven't slept well since. Every little sound outside makes me jump, and I keep wondering if he's going to come back. I still don't know if he was telling the truth or if something much worse could have happened if I'd opened the door. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe he really did need help and just wandered off. Or maybe, well, I don't even want to think about the other possibility. I haven't seen him since that night, but sometimes late at night, I hear faint knocking. It's probably nothing, but every time I wonder, what if he's still out there, waiting for me to let him in? The van. I walk home late most nights. It's not something I used to think twice about. My neighborhood is quiet, pretty safe, and I like the walk after a long shift. Something about the silence of the streets helped me clear my head. It was routine, you know? Same streets, same turns, no surprises. But recently, it's been different. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Just little stuff that didn't sit right. A parked car that hadn't been there before. Footsteps behind me that always disappeared when I look back. One night, I even caught myself speeding up without really knowing why. I started feeling on edge, but I brushed it off. Paranoia, I told myself. Until I saw the van. It was just sitting there, parked a little down the street from my place. A plain white van. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe the fact that I'd never seen it before. I told myself I was being stupid. It's just a van. I went inside and tried to forget about it. A few nights later, I saw it again. I was halfway home when the van pulled up beside me. It was driving slowly, keeping pace with my steps. I told myself it was nothing, just someone looking for an address or something. But the van stayed there, inching along beside me in the quiet night. No engine roar, no music, no one rolling down a window to ask for directions. Just there. I changed routes, hoping it would keep going, but it didn't. The van followed. My heart started pounding. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe it's a coincidence, but then I sped up, and so did the van. That's when the fear kicked in. I started taking random turns, trying to lose it, but it kept coming, always a few feet behind. Panic set in, and I felt like I was being hunted. I was about to break into a run when, without warning, the van sped off, disappearing around the corner like nothing ever happened. The relief washed over me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I felt watched, targeted. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the van. I told myself it was a fluke, but I started noticing white vans everywhere. There was one parked across the street from my apartment the next morning. Another passed by my work that afternoon. They were always there, always empty, always just sitting. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just bad luck. Plenty of people drive white vans, right? But then it kept happening. They were everywhere. My paranoia got worse. I started drawing the curtains and double-checking the locks every night. I even considered going to the police, but what would I say? That a van was following me? That I was seeing vans everywhere? It sounded insane. I started walking different routes home, hoping to avoid the van, but no matter what I did, it always seemed to find me. There was no pattern. Sometimes it showed up right away. Other times it wouldn't appear until I was almost home. But every time, my heart would race, and I'd feel that sickening sense of being watched. Sleep became impossible. I dreamed of the van parked outside, headlights off, waiting for me. Some nights, I'd wake up in a panic, swearing I heard tires crunching the gravel outside my window. Then, one evening, I left work earlier than usual. I took a different route home, one I had never used before. I thought I could avoid it this time. But as I turned down a dark, narrow street, I heard it. The low hum of an engine behind me. I didn't even have to look. I knew it was the van. I started running. I sprinted through alleys and side streets, weaving through the dark, trying to lose it. I could hear the van in the distance, but every time I glanced back, it was nowhere to be seen. It felt like it was always one step behind, waiting for the perfect moment to catch up. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. Eventually, I found myself in front of an apartment building. I ran up to the door and pounded on the bell, hoping someone would let me in, but no one answered. The street was dead silent, and I was alone. That's when I saw it. The van was at the end of the street, just sitting there. No headlights, no movement. The quiet was deafening. My heart raced, and I felt like I was being suffocated by the weight of my own fear. I didn't know if anyone was inside, but I felt their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I froze. My phone was dead. There was no one around. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, staring at the van as it sat motionless at the end of the street. Then, out of nowhere, a car drove by. The van's headlights flicked on, and it sped off into the night, vanishing around the corner like it had never been there. I stood there for what felt like forever, too scared to move. Eventually, I forced myself to start walking home, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every shadow looked like the van, every sound made my pulse quicken. I made it home, but there was no relief. The danger wasn't gone. It was still there, somewhere, watching. I sat at my kitchen table staring out the window. Part of me hoped I wouldn't see it again, but another part knew it wasn't over. As I stood up to close the curtains, I saw a pair of headlights turn the corner. I can't live like this anymore. The van could be anywhere, and I'll never know when it'll show up again. But I know one thing for sure. Whoever's driving it isn't done with me yet. The call came from inside. I never thought much about the landline in my apartment. It came with the place, and since I never gave out the number, it never rang. My name is Claire, and I've lived alone in this tiny one-bedroom apartment for about 6 months. It's cozy, but in an older building in a rundown part of town. The kind of place where the floors creak if you breathe too hard, and you can hear your neighbors through the thin walls. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend a lot of time alone. My days are routine, long hours in front of my laptop, late-night TV, and delivery dinners. Life was quiet, predictable, until that first call. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., when the phone rang. It startled me, as I wasn't used to hearing it. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but I picked it up, more out of curiosity than anything. "Are you alone?" a man's voice asked. I hung up immediately. My heart raced, and I felt stupid for letting a random phone call scare me. It had to be a prank or a wrong number. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I checked the locks on the door before going to bed, something I normally never bothered to do. The next night, the phone rang again. This time, the voice asked, "Why don't you lock your door?" I froze. How did he know? I had locked the door, hadn't I? Panic set in. I double-checked the locks and even moved a chair in front of the door. I told myself it was probably some sick joke, but the calls kept coming. "Do you know who I am?" I stopped answering the phone after that. Every ring made my stomach twist with dread. I tried to act normal during the day, but at night, every little noise in the apartment made me jump. It didn't help that the building itself made strange noises, creaking floors, groaning pipes. My mind started playing tricks on me. One night, after yet another call, I decided to talk to the building manager. He shrugged it off, saying the phone system was old, probably picking up crossed lines from other apartments. But his explanation didn't feel right. How would another tenant know I hadn't locked my door? I felt more alone than ever. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing soft footsteps in the hall, doors creaking, but whenever I checked, nothing was there. I tried unplugging the phone, but somehow it still rang. The voice on the other end started mentioning things about my daily life. "Nice shirt," he said one day, after I'd worn my favorite blue sweater. Another time, "You left your keys by the window." I became obsessed with figuring out where the calls were coming from. I noticed the phone only rang when I was home, never when I was out. And the voice, his voice, was always calm, like he knew he had the upper hand. One night the voice said, "I can see you." That was when I snapped. I grabbed the phone and yanked the cord, following it through the apartment, determined to find the source. The cord ran along the wall, around the corner, and into a small, locked closet I'd never bothered with. My pulse pounded in my ears as I realized what this meant. The calls were coming from inside my own apartment. I panicked, grabbing my keys and rushing to the door, but when I tried to unlock it, the knob wouldn't turn. I yanked on it harder, but it was no use. The door was locked. From the inside. The phone rang again. I didn't answer this time. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed, listening. And then I heard his voice. Not from the phone, but somewhere in the apartment. "I've been here all along," he said, his voice echoing through the space. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hand shaking. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move, room by room, searching for him. Every creak of the floor, every shadow made my heart race. I could feel him watching me. Suddenly, a figure moved across the hallway. I froze, too scared to breathe. Slowly, I approached the closet. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, knowing what I would find. Inside, taped to the door, was a note. "I've been here all along." I stumbled back, choking on my breath. I had to get out. With a surge of adrenaline, I forced the door open and ran outside, collapsing onto the street as I dialed 911. My body was trembling so violently, I could barely speak to the operator. The police arrived quickly. They searched the apartment but found nothing. The second phone line was disconnected, but no sign of an intruder. No one had seen anyone enter or leave the building. I tried explaining, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Was it all in my head? Was I losing my mind? I don't know. But as I stood there, watching them leave, the phone rang again. I haven't gone back to the apartment since that night. I'm staying with friends now, but no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching. The police have no leads, no answers. I've been thinking of moving far away, maybe even changing my number, but I doubt that will help. because sometimes, late at night, I still hear the phone ring. The Airbnb horror. Last year, my partner and I decided we desperately needed a break from work. We were both stressed, burnt out, and thought a weekend away in the countryside would be perfect. After scrolling through Airbnb, we found this cute little cottage in a rural town. It looked like a postcard, surrounded by woods, isolated but cozy. We booked it without a second thought. The drive there was peaceful. The further we got from the city, the more relaxed I felt. By the time we arrived, we were both ready to disconnect from everything. The house was exactly as pictured, but something about it seemed off once we got inside. There was this musty smell I couldn't quite place, and I noticed the door to the attic was slightly open, even though it was supposed to be locked. I also couldn't shake the feeling that the windows, despite being in the middle of the day, seemed to face pure darkness. Still, I chalked it up to my imagination. It's an old house after all. I told myself it was nothing. That first night, I heard faint scratching sounds from the attic. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just squirrels or birds. Still, something about it put me on edge. The next morning, things started to feel off. My partner and I woke up to little changes around the house. One of the chairs in the living room had moved slightly, and one of the windows was open. We were both sure we'd closed and locked everything the night before. When I went to grab my toothbrush, I noticed it was damp, even though neither of us had brushed our teeth yet. It was strange, but again, we didn't think much of it. Maybe we just forgot something. After a long hike in the woods nearby, we returned to the house, and I immediately noticed the front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. My partner laughed it off, saying I probably just forgot in the rush to leave. I tried to relax, but my gut told me something was wrong. Later that night, after my shower, I noticed something written on the bathroom mirror, faintly visible in the condensation. "I see you." My heart dropped. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. My partner laughed when I told them about it. They thought it was a prank from the last guests, or maybe some leftover writing from kids, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. That night, the scratching in the attic was louder. I went to check the door, but it was locked. The strange thing was, I hadn't touched the door since we arrived. Over the next 2 days, things only got worse. Our belongings started turning up in odd places. My phone, which I was sure I'd left on the nightstand, was suddenly in the kitchen. My partner's jacket, which they swore they left hanging on the chair, was found on the floor. Every time I tried to rationalize it, something else would happen. The sense that someone was watching us grew stronger, especially at night. I couldn't sleep, convinced that whoever, or whatever, was in the house was waiting for us to let our guard down. I wanted to leave, but my partner thought I was overreacting. They didn't see the signs the way I did. I decided to check the Airbnb host profile for any clues, but it didn't help. The host hadn't responded to any of our messages since we arrived, despite being listed as available 24/7. That only made me feel worse. One evening, after we came back from dinner, there was a new message on the bathroom mirror. "Why haven't you left?" That's when I knew for sure someone was in the house with us. I told my partner again, but they still insisted we were just spooking ourselves. That night, while my partner was asleep, I found a hidden camera in the bedroom. It was tucked into the smoke detector. I was horrified. I couldn't believe it. Someone had been watching us the whole time. I didn't know how long it had been there or how many cameras there were, but I knew we had to leave immediately. Finally, my partner agreed to pack up and go, but just as we started throwing our things together, the power went out. The house was plunged into total darkness. Suddenly, both our phones buzzed with notifications. When we checked, the messages were pictures. pictures of us taken inside the house. There were shots from the attic, from the bedroom, from the bathroom, everywhere we had been. They were all time-stamped. The last one, taken just seconds before, showed me standing in the hallway. Panic set in. We grabbed our bags and headed for the front door, but it wouldn't open. It was jammed. I tried the windows, but they were sealed shut too. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving above us in the attic. My partner was freaking out now, but I had to stay calm. I grabbed a kitchen knife and we barricaded ourselves in one of the rooms, trying to figure out what to do next. The footsteps grew heavier. Whoever was in the attic was moving around, pacing, almost as if they were waiting for something. Just when we thought it couldn't get worse, we heard the front door unlock from the outside. Footsteps approached, and then nothing. I don't know how we got out. I don't remember much after that, just running, the car starting, and driving away as fast as we could. When we got home, I reported it to Airbnb and the police, but they said there wasn't enough evidence of anything criminal. The listing disappeared the next day. It's been months since it happened, and I still don't feel safe. I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching. Late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that scratching sound, even though we're miles away from that house. If you're reading this, please, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't wait. Get out while you can. I take the train home late at night, almost every night. After long hours at my stressful job, the quiet, nearly empty train rides are my way of unwinding. I've come to appreciate the eerie stillness of the city at night. The train usually has only a few people, most of them tired, just like me. Rows of empty seats, the hum of the train on the tracks. It's peaceful in its own way. But lately, something has been off. I've noticed someone, a guy. He's been at the same platform at the same time for the past few nights. I hadn't thought much of it at first. Plenty of people take the train at odd hours. But then I started hearing footsteps behind me when I left the station. Every time I turned to look, there was no one there. Just my imagination, I'd tell myself. Tonight, though, I'm more on edge than usual. As I settle into my usual seat, I notice a figure in the corner of my eye. A man steps onto the train from the far end of the car. He hesitates by the doors for a second, and then he starts walking down the aisle, straight toward me. He's dressed sharply, which is strange for this time of night. A button-down shirt, dark pants, polished shoes. Definitely not your average late-night commuter. The train is almost empty, but instead of sitting far away, like most people would, he sits right next to me. Too close. I feel a chill. Late night, huh? His voice is low, casual, but there's something about it that makes my skin crawl. Yeah, I reply, trying to keep my voice steady. I look out the window, hoping he'll get the hint and leave me alone. But he doesn't. What do you do? He asks, his eyes fixed on me. I can feel his gaze even though I'm not looking at him. Work, I say vaguely. I don't owe him any more than that. Where do you work? His questions are coming too quickly now, and each one is more invasive than the last. I force a smile, trying to keep things light. Just an office job. Do you always take this train at night? He's not letting up. My heart starts to race. Why does he care? I shift uncomfortably in my seat, my hands starting to sweat. Sometimes, I mumble. I glance at him and notice something unsettling. He's angled his body toward me, his eyes darting to my phone in my bag. He's paying way too much attention to my every move. My pulse quickens. Is he watching me? Targeting me? I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. And then, the question that makes my blood run cold. Do you mind if I get off at your stop? What? My stomach drops. I try to play it cool, but I can't help the panic rising in my chest. Actually, I'm getting off at the next stop. I lie, hoping to throw him off. He smiles, but it doesn't reach his eyes. Me too. I freeze. Every nerve in my body is screaming to get away from this guy, but there's nowhere to go. The train is still moving, and the next stop feels like an eternity away. I can't think straight. Is he following me? Has he been watching me this whole time? My mind races. What if he knows where I live? What if he's been waiting for the perfect moment? I can't stay on this train, not with him sitting so close, staring like he knows something I don't. I try to act normal, scrolling through my phone, but I can't focus on anything. My hands are shaking. Out of the corner of my eye, I see him glance at my phone. I stand up, pretending to stretch, hoping to move to another seat, but his eyes follow me. I feel trapped, like prey. With each passing second, my fear grows. What if he gets off the train with me? What if he follows me home? The train is slowing down for the next stop, and I make my decision. As soon as the doors open, I bolt. I don't look back. I don't even care if I'm making a scene. I just need to get away. My footsteps echo loudly on the empty platform as I run toward the exit. I can't hear him, but I don't dare turn around. My heart is pounding in my ears, and my lungs are burning, but I keep running. The station is deserted, and the silence only makes it worse. Every shadow looks like him. Every sound is amplified in my head. I don't know where to go. My phone's in my hand, but I'm too panicked to dial for help. What if no one answers? What if he's right behind me? I hear footsteps. They're fast. They're getting closer. I whirl around, ready to scream, and there he is. The man from the train, standing just a few feet away, staring at me with that same blank expression. "Stay back!" I shout, backing up toward the stairs. My hands are shaking so badly I can barely hold my phone. My whole body is tense, ready to fight if I have to. But then, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a badge. "Stop. I'm a detective. We need to talk." For a second, I don't understand. The words don't make sense. A detective? He steps closer, still holding the badge. "We've been investigating a string of robberies in the area. You fit the description of someone we've been looking for." I'm speechless. The fear drains out of me, replaced by confusion. I'm not. The detective lowers the badge and gives me an apologetic look. "I'm sorry if I scared you. We had to be sure." I don't know what to say. My heart is still racing, but the danger is suddenly gone. "I'm not who you're looking for," I manage to say, my voice trembling. He nods. "I believe you. You're free to go." I walk away slowly, my mind still reeling. Relief washes over me, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched. As I leave the station, I glance over my shoulder one last time. He's not there. But I know, even though this is over, I'll never feel safe on the train again. The locked door. My partner Jess and I had just moved into this new apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was in a quiet neighborhood, which was exactly what we were looking for. The building itself had some charm: old brick, creaky floors, and drafty windows that added a bit of character. The landlord, Mr. Keller, was an older guy who didn't say much. He seemed eager to get us settled quickly. There wasn't anything particularly unsettling, except for a door at the end of the hallway. Mr. Keller said it led to a storage room, but it was locked. Jess and I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another quirk of an old building, we thought. Life went on as usual. We settled into our routines: work, unpacking, getting used to the new place. Sometimes, we'd hear strange creaks and groans from the building, but it all seemed normal enough. Still, something felt a bit off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The first night we spent there, I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from behind the locked door. It was so soft that I brushed it off as the building settling. but it was enough to plant a seed of unease. The tapping didn't stop. Every night, just past midnight, it would start again. At first, it was faint and easy to ignore, but it kept happening at the same time. Jess heard it too. "It's probably just the pipes," she said one night, trying to sound casual, but I could tell she was bothered. Then, the sound changed. It became more rhythmic, like someone was gently knocking on the other side. The kind of knock that's too soft to be demanding, but persistent enough to get your attention. Jess woke up and stared at the door, her face pale in the dim light. "We should ask Mr. Keller about it," she suggested. The next day, I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge, locked tight. I asked Mr. Keller if we could get the key just to check inside. He waved me off, said he'd lost it, and assured me it was nothing but an old storage room. His indifference didn't sit right with me, but Jess said we should let it go. Still, that knocking felt too deliberate to ignore. One night, the knocking grew louder, almost desperate. I got up and went to check the door, and that's when I noticed something odd. There was a faint light coming from underneath, but there were no windows on the other side, and the room was supposed to be empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the locked door was gnawing at me. I started poking around the building, trying to make sense of it. One evening while Jess was out, I found my way into the basement. It was dark and musty, the kind of place no one ever visits unless they have to. That's when I stumbled upon it. A hidden network of tunnels running under the building, stretching out beneath the whole block. I didn't know what to make of it. These tunnels looked ancient, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what really unsettled me were the footprints. Fresh ones, leading deeper into the dark. I followed them a little way but quickly turned back when the air got too thick with dampness and rot. The whole thing felt wrong. Meanwhile, things in the apartment got worse. The knocking became erratic, and Jess and I both started feeling like we were being watched. We'd find small things out of place. Our keys moved, drawers left slightly open. Food went missing from the fridge, little things at first. Then one night, Jess swore she heard breathing right outside our bedroom door. We called the police, but there was no sign of forced entry. They chalked it up to our nerves, said old buildings can mess with your head. Mr. Keller remained as vague as ever, brushing off any mention of the basement or the locked door. A few days later, I came back from the basement, and the locked door? It was ajar. I swear I had locked it before leaving. Jess and I knew we couldn't stay there any longer. We packed what we could and planned to leave the next morning. But as we were gathering our things, the knocking started again, louder this time, frantic. It sounded like someone was trying to get out. Jess was terrified and begged me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. Grabbing a crowbar, I forced it open. The room inside was small and empty, lit only by a weak bulb hanging from the ceiling. No furniture, no windows, just bare, cracked walls. But the floorboards were scratched up, like something had been clawing at them from inside. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, Jess screamed from the living room. "There's someone at the door!" I rushed to her, but when I got there, the hallway was empty. Whoever had been standing there was gone, but the air was thick with something, like we weren't alone. We grabbed our things and bolted for the door, but before we left, I saw it. In the empty room, on one of the walls, there was a small hole, barely noticeable. I bent down and looked through it. Something moved. There was someone, or something, on the other side, watching us. We left that night, not even bothering to pack everything. Jess was shaken, barely speaking the whole drive. We moved to a different part of town, thinking we'd be able to put it behind us, but something still feels wrong. Even in our new place, I sometimes hear knocking. Jess says it's just my mind playing tricks on me after everything that happened, but I can't shake the feeling. Late one night, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. When I opened it, my heart stopped. It was a photo of the apartment we had just left. The door to the locked room was wide open. I've since changed my number and moved again, but it doesn't matter. Every time I close my eyes, I see that hole in the wall. I feel like I'm being watched, no matter where I go. I don't know who or what it was, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not done with us yet. I've always liked driving at night. There's something peaceful about the empty roads, just me and my thoughts. I'd often get out of work late, and the quiet highways became a routine. I have a family waiting for me at home, my husband and 2 little ones. So I'd always make these drives as quick as possible, eager to see their faces. The roads were usually dead, with only the occasional gas station lit up like a beacon in the distance. That night was different. The darkness felt heavier, and the highway was emptier than usual. I wasn't easily spooked, but something felt off. As I drove, I noticed a car slowing down ahead of me, but it seemed abandoned. Then I saw him, a man standing by the side of the road, waving. His car had its hood up, steam rising into the air. I should have kept driving. My gut told me not to stop, but I ignored it. I pulled over. He looked normal enough. Hoodie, jeans, a bit scruffy but not threatening. "Thanks so much," he said as he slid into the passenger seat. "My car broke down a few miles back." "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile. "Where are you headed?" He gave me a vague answer about a gas station up the road, and I started driving again. At first, everything was fine. He was polite, but then his tone shifted. He asked me where I lived, if I had kids. I didn't answer directly, but he kept pushing, making small talk that dug a little too deep. He mentioned a cafe I hadn't brought up, a park near my house. How did he know about those places? My grip tightened on the wheel, but I tried to act calm, nodding and keeping my responses short. As we neared the gas station, he casually said, "So, you've got a blue front door, right?" My heart skipped. I hadn't told him that. "Yeah, the house on the corner, right?" He smiled like it was a joke, but my stomach twisted in knots. How could he know? I decided to drop him at the gas station and drive off, no matter how rude it seemed. The tension in the car was unbearable now. My mind raced. What if he knew more than just the color of my door? What if he had been watching me, or worse, my family? We were only a few miles from the gas station when he pulled out his phone. "I need to show you something," he said. He swiped through his photos and then held the screen up to my face. It was a picture of my house. My kids were outside, playing in the yard, taken just minutes ago. My chest tightened. My breath caught in my throat. "I've been keeping an eye on things," he said, his voice too calm, too casual. "You wouldn't want anything to happen to them, would you?" I didn't know what to do. I thought about slamming on the brakes, maybe crashing the car to escape, but I was paralyzed by the thought of what he might do, or what he'd already done. If he was here with me, who else was at my house? "I'm just saying, you don't want to make any sudden moves," he continued, his voice low. "You've got a beautiful family." Every instinct screamed at me to get away, but I couldn't act rashly. My kids, my husband, they were in danger, and he knew everything about me. I forced myself to stay calm, even though my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. The gas station lights flickered in the distance, and I had no choice but to pull in. My mind was racing. Should I run inside and scream for help? Should I keep driving and hope he didn't retaliate? But as I slowed to a stop, he turned to me, that same calm smile on his face. "You're not alone," he said. Before I could process what he meant, a second car pulled into the lot. Another man was inside, just sitting there, waiting. The hitchhiker got out of my car without another word, walking toward the other vehicle. He glanced back at me and nodded, like he knew there was nothing I could do. My phone buzzed in my lap. With shaking hands, I picked it up. A text from an unknown number. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. It was another picture of my children, but this one was taken inside my house. The timestamp was recent, too recent. I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching as the hitchhiker and his companion drove off into the night, leaving me behind. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think straight. Were they still watching my house? Was someone inside right now? The gas station attendant glanced my way, probably wondering why I hadn't gotten out of the car, but I couldn't move. My entire body felt numb. Finally, I forced myself to start driving. I didn't know where to go. My house didn't feel safe, but there was nowhere else I could go at that hour. My thoughts were jumbled, and every turn I took felt like the wrong one. And then I noticed it. The second car from the gas station, following me at a distance. I knew this wasn't over. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. Every shadow on the road seemed like a threat. Every glance in my rearview mirror filled me with dread. They were still out there, watching, waiting. Eventually, I found myself back at my house. The lights were off, everything quiet. I parked outside, staring at the front door, unable to bring myself to go inside. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't check it this time. I just sat there, in the darkness, knowing something was terribly wrong. I'm still waiting. I recently moved into a quiet apartment in an average neighborhood. It wasn't anything special, but it was affordable, and I liked the solitude. I work from home, mostly late at night, and I enjoyed the peaceful environment. The building had only a few tenants, and my apartment was on the top floor, so I rarely interacted with anyone. It was perfect for someone like me who preferred keeping to themselves. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent my nights working, occasionally stepping out onto the balcony to take a break. It was quiet, almost too quiet sometimes. After a couple of weeks, I started noticing faint sounds coming from above me. They were so soft I barely paid attention to them at first. Just something like faint thuds, maybe an animal on the roof. But the more I heard them, the more I realized they sounded deliberate. Footsteps. One night, while I was sitting on the couch after finishing up work, I heard it again. This time it was clear. Slow, steady footsteps on the roof. Not the random scurrying of an animal. Someone was walking back and forth. That was the first time I felt uneasy. The footsteps became a regular thing after that, like clockwork. Every night around 3 a.m., I'd hear the same sounds, slow steps, always at the same pace. It felt like someone pacing above me. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone had roof access? But there was no reason anyone should be up there at that hour. After a few nights of this, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I reached out to my landlord. They were dismissive, saying the roof was locked and no one should be able to access it. Probably just birds or something, they said. That didn't sit right with me, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I left it at that. Still, the footsteps didn't stop. Every night, 3 a.m. sharp, I would lie in bed, listening to the sound of someone walking above me. The pattern, the timing, it was too consistent to be anything random. I started to feel paranoid. Was someone watching me? Was I being targeted? One morning, after another restless night, I stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air, and that's when I saw it. Muddy footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were small, like someone had been standing near the railing facing my apartment. Then they just stopped, like the person had disappeared. The footprints were the final straw. I knew something wasn't right and I had to find out what was going on. I bought a security camera and set it up on the balcony, aimed toward the door. I was determined to catch whoever was sneaking around. My paranoia grew by the day. I started avoiding the balcony at night, keeping all the windows locked and double-checking the door. The footsteps, though, kept coming. Each night, 3 a.m., I'd hear them. My sleep was wrecked. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound. The next morning, I checked the footage from the camera. To my shock, there was nothing. Well, almost nothing. From 2:55 to 3:15 a.m., the camera had stopped recording. A gap, exactly when the footsteps would have started. I felt a chill go down my spine. Someone had disabled the camera. I called the landlord again. Their response was the same. No one had access to the roof or the balconies. I could tell they were getting frustrated with me, but I didn't care. I needed answers. I even reached out to my neighbors, but no one seemed to know or care about the strange noises. Some of them just avoided the conversation altogether. Then, one night, after barely sleeping for days, I woke up and noticed something odd. The balcony door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. My heart raced as I approached the door, hands shaking. I quickly shut it and checked every corner of the apartment, but no one was there. Still, the thought lingered. Someone had been inside. At this point, I was scared out of my mind. I had to leave, but I felt trapped. There was no solid proof, just a string of bizarre events that didn't make sense. I stayed up every night watching the balcony door, half expecting to see someone standing there, staring back at me. The footsteps continued, but now they weren't alone. I started hearing faint scratching near the windows, little whispers that I couldn't quite make out. It felt like something was trying to get inside. Desperate, I decided to investigate the roof myself. One night, around 2:45 a.m., I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the stairwell. But when I got there, I found the door to the roof padlocked. No one should have been up there. I hurried back to my apartment, but when I reached the balcony, I found a crumpled piece of paper near the door. It read, "I see you." My blood ran cold. Someone was watching me, but I had no idea who or why. I tried setting up another camera, this time hidden inside the apartment. The next morning, I checked the footage. Once again, it cut out. This time, though, there was a brief moment of something, a shadowy figure moving toward the balcony door just before the camera died. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, determined to leave the apartment by the weekend. But even as I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The footsteps continued, louder now, more erratic. The sounds grew closer, scratching at the windows, faint whispers that made my skin crawl. On the night before I was set to leave, I heard a loud crash from the balcony. I froze. Slowly, I walked to the door and found the lock broken. Whatever, or whoever, had been out there was trying to get in. I moved out the next day, but the fear didn't leave me. I'm in a new apartment now, safer, more secure. But the memories of those footsteps haven't gone away. I haven't heard anything strange since I left, but I still wake up at 3 a.m., listening for footsteps that aren't there. Sometimes I check my new balcony in the morning just to make sure no footprints are there. I travel a lot for work, more than I'd like. After a while, every hotel feels the same, sterile, bland, and completely forgettable. The routine is familiar. Flights, taxis, hotels, conferences, repeat. You check in, sleep, leave, and barely remember which city you were in. But what happened a few months ago is something I'll never forget. It was a late evening when I arrived at this particular hotel. Nothing about it stood out, just another standard, mid-range place booked by my company. I was exhausted from a long flight, so I wasn't paying close attention to details. The check-in was quick, though I remember feeling a bit uneasy when the receptionist barely glanced at my ID. They seemed distracted, but I brushed it off. I was too tired to care. As I dragged my suitcase down the hallway, I heard a strange creak behind me. It was probably just the building settling, I told myself, but a little voice in the back of my head wouldn't shut up. Maybe it was just fatigue messing with me, but I had that weird feeling, like someone was watching me. I shook it off and kept walking. When I reached what I thought was my room, something was off. The door was slightly open. I stopped for a second, debating whether I should go back to the front desk, but then I figured maybe housekeeping had left it unlocked by mistake. Hotels mess up all the time, right? I'd been through enough late-night check-ins to know mistakes happen. I pushed the door open. Inside, the room looked lived in. Luggage sat against the wall, clothes were tossed across the bed, and there was even a half-eaten sandwich on the desk. My first thought was that they'd accidentally given me a room someone was already staying in. I checked my keycard again. Room 307. The same number was on the door. I felt a little wave of panic but tried to stay calm. I stepped inside to look around, thinking maybe I'd figure out what was going on. The bed looked like someone had just gotten up, and the bathroom light was flickering. I walked over and pushed the door open, half expecting to find someone inside. It was empty, just the sound of water dripping from the faucet. My heart started racing. This didn't feel right. I was ready to turn around and head back to the front desk when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, right outside the door. I froze. The steps stopped just outside the room. I could hear my own breathing getting louder. Then the doorknob started to turn slowly, like someone was testing if it was locked. Without thinking, I ducked into the closet. The door creaked open and someone stepped inside the room. My whole body went rigid as I listened. They didn't say anything, but I could hear them moving around, shuffling through the luggage, rustling the bed sheets. My mind was racing. Who was this? What kind of person had just walked in? Were they dangerous? Could they tell I was hiding? Through a small crack in the closet door, I saw a shadow move across the room. Every second felt like an hour. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they'd hear it. Then, I heard them sit down at the desk, maybe checking their phone or something. I realized they were planning to stay for a while. Suddenly, they stood up. My heart dropped. I could hear their footsteps coming closer to the closet. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't open the door. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Just as they reached the closet door, there was a knock. Someone at the room door. The person in the room stopped, then turned and walked toward the door. I didn't wait for anything else. The moment their back was turned, I slipped out of the closet, out of the room, and into the hallway. I didn't even look back. I ran. I don't think I've ever moved that fast in my life. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby, my heart still racing. The receptionist was there, looking up as I practically fell into the desk. I tried to explain what happened. Wrong room, someone inside, but they just looked confused. They checked the computer and told me there was no one staying in that room. No reservation for room 307. I didn't believe them. I insisted on going back up with security. When we got back to the room, it was completely empty. No luggage, no clothes. No half-eaten sandwich. It was like no one had ever been there. Everything looked spotless, untouched. The receptionist shrugged it off, saying there had been a mix-up earlier, but the room hadn't been assigned to anyone after all. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I was just so tired that I'd imagined it. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I tried to sleep in a different room that night, but every little sound kept me awake. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside had me on edge. I kept expecting the door to open or to hear those same footsteps approaching again. I barely slept at all. Even now, months later, I still can't shake the feeling that something was wrong that night. I haven't stayed in a hotel since. The idea of unlocking another door, walking into another strange room, I just can't do it. I don't know what really happened, and I guess I never will. But sometimes I wonder if I narrowly escaped something much worse than just a simple room mix-up. Maybe the hotel just didn't want me to know the truth. And what's really unsettling? After I posted about this online, someone else commented saying they had a similar experience at the same hotel. I've been a delivery driver for about 10 years. I'm used to early mornings, quiet streets, and the repetitive routes that make up most of my day. My life is pretty routine. I live in a small suburb with my wife and our 7-year-old daughter, and up until a few weeks ago, everything was normal. Now, things are different. It started with a van. Just an ordinary, unmarked white van parked a few houses down from mine. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe it belonged to a contractor or someone visiting a neighbor. It was just one of those things you notice in passing. But after a couple of days, I started seeing it more and more. I'd see it when I left for work early in the morning, always in the same spot, and then again when I came home. It didn't seem to move. At some point, I started wondering why. One night, after a long shift, I pulled into my driveway and noticed the van had moved, now parked closer to my house. It wasn't directly in front of my house, but close enough that it made me feel uneasy. It was subtle, but something about its new position made me look twice. A few days later, the van was still there, and that's when I started seeing it in other places. I'd see it parked near my work, early in the morning when I arrived. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just coincidence. It was just a van, after all, but then I saw it at the grocery store, parked a few rows away from my car. I started seeing it everywhere. The worst was when I saw it outside my daughter's school. I was picking her up one afternoon, and there it was, parked across the street. That's when my concern turned to something else, fear. Why was this van following me? Or was I just being paranoid? I didn't say anything to my wife at first. I didn't want to worry her, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to think. But once I started seeing the van nearly everywhere I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, looking for the driver, but no matter where I saw the van, it was always empty. It sat there, still, with no sign of movement. One night, after putting out the trash, I saw the van again, this time parked directly across from my house. My heart stopped. I could have sworn I saw someone inside, just a faint silhouette, but when I blinked, it was gone. I stared at the van for a few minutes, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Eventually, I went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Things got worse after that. I started losing sleep, lying awake at night, thinking about the van. Every time I left the house, I expected to see it. I tried telling my wife, but she thought I was overreacting. "You've been working too much," she said. "You need to rest." But I knew what I saw. I even tried calling the police, but they couldn't do anything without a clear threat or a license plate number. It was just a van, they said. Probably nothing to worry about. But it wasn't nothing. I started changing my routines, taking different routes to work, switching up when I picked up my daughter from school. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. Some days I wouldn't see the van at all, and I'd think maybe it was over. But then it would show up again, parked somewhere near me, like it was waiting. One evening, after picking up my daughter from school, I saw the van in my rearview mirror. I tried to stay calm, but as I drove through the neighborhood, it stayed right behind me. My heart was racing. I started taking random turns, trying to lose it. Eventually, I pulled into my driveway, but when I looked back, the van was gone. I sat in my car, trying to catch my breath, but when I stepped out and glanced down the street, there it was, parked at the end of the block. That was the breaking point for me. That night, I grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat from the garage. I was done being afraid. I needed answers. I marched down the street toward the van, my heart pounding. As I got closer, every part of me was screaming to turn back, but I kept going. When I reached the van, I shone the flashlight into the driver's seat. Nothing. It was empty, just like it always was. I circled the van, checking the windows and doors. Locked. It was like it was mocking me. Defeated, I started walking back toward my house, my skin crawling. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Then I heard it, the faint sound of an engine starting. I turned around just in time to see the van pulling away, slowly disappearing into the night. For the next few days, the van was gone. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but things had changed. I felt like a different person, jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every car that passed by the house made me tense. My wife noticed I was acting strange, but I didn't know how to explain it. I wasn't even sure I understood it myself. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was over. Maybe the van was gone for good. But one night, as I was locking up the house, I glanced out the window. My heart dropped. There, down the street, barely visible in the dim light, was the van. I don't think it's ever going to stop. I don't know who's in that van or why they're watching me, but they are. If you see an unmarked van parked on your street, don't ignore it. Trust me. I've never been the type to scare easily, but what happened a few weeks ago still keeps me up at night. I'm sharing this here because I can't stop thinking about it, and maybe someone out there can tell me I'm not losing my mind. That night started like any other. I work long hours, and by the time I get home, it's usually dark. My wife, Sarah, typically goes to bed early since she's up before sunrise. We've lived in this house for years, a quiet suburban place just outside the city. Nothing exciting happens here, which is why it's so perfect for us. But when I pulled into the driveway, something was different. The front door was slightly open. I wasn't immediately alarmed. Sarah had a habit of forgetting to lock the door when she was tired, and maybe she just left it ajar. I tried to brush it off as I stepped out of the car, but something felt off, even before I set foot inside. I pushed the door open and called out, "Sarah?" No response. The house was pitch dark, the only light coming from a distant street lamp outside. I flipped the hall light on, expecting to hear her stir upstairs, but there was nothing. The silence was unsettling. As I walked further inside, little things caught my eye. The dining room chairs were slightly out of place. The TV remote wasn't where I usually left it. There were magazines scattered across the coffee table, ones we didn't even subscribe to. The air felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Maybe Sarah had moved things around while cleaning, but her car wasn't in the driveway, and there hadn't been any messages from her on my phone. Just silence. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. My heart was starting to race, even though I had no reason to panic yet. When I reached the top, I noticed the bedroom light was on. That was odd. Sarah always turned the lights off before bed. My stomach churned, but I pushed the door open. The bed was a mess. Sheets tangled, pillows tossed aside, like someone had been sleeping in it. But I knew it was perfectly made that morning. My skin started to prickle. The closet door was cracked open, clothes thrown on the floor. Some of them were men's clothes, but they weren't mine. They looked familiar, though, just off enough to make me question everything. I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling as I tried to call Sarah. No answer. That's when I noticed a missed call from an unknown number. I played the voicemail, hoping for an explanation, but what I heard made my blood run cold. It was my voice on the recording, but I didn't remember leaving that message. "Come home. We need to talk," it said, calm and steady. That's when I heard it. A noise downstairs. A soft creak, like someone walking across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and every hair on my neck stood up. Someone was in the house. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a kitchen knife from the drawer in the hall, and made my way back down the stairs as quietly as I could. The sound had come from the living room. I stepped into the room, knife clenched tightly in my hand, and that's when I saw it. Someone was sitting on my couch. Their back was turned to me, but something about the way they sat, so still, so calm, made my stomach drop. My voice shook as I spoke. "Who are you? Get out of my house." They didn't move. I took a step closer, and my voice grew louder, more frantic. I said, "Get out." Slowly, the figure stood up and turned around. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I was staring at myself. Same face, same clothes, down to the way my hair fell over my forehead. It was like looking into a mirror, but this was no reflection. The doppelganger smiled, an eerie, knowing smile. They didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no logic. None of this was possible. "You're too late," the doppelganger finally said, their voice calm and steady, exactly like mine. Before I could react, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Sarah. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to warn her, but my legs wouldn't move. The doppelganger turned away from me, walking calmly toward the front door as if they belonged here. I stood frozen, knife still in my hand, completely helpless. The door opened, and I saw Sarah step inside. Her face lit up with a smile when she saw them. Me, but not me. She walked up to the doppelganger, giving them a quick kiss on the cheek, like nothing was wrong, like she had done it 100 times before. "Hey," she said, "I didn't think you'd be home so early." I stood there, watching them, my heart pounding in my ears. Sarah was acting like everything was normal, like she didn't see me standing in the doorway with a knife, staring at my own replacement. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I was paralyzed. The doppelganger turned back toward me, giving me one last, knowing smile before they led Sarah further into the house. I dropped the knife. I still don't know what happened that night, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. Sarah hasn't mentioned anything unusual since then, and she acts like everything is fine. But every time I walk into my house, I wonder if I've already been replaced. I wonder if it's too late. The long drive. I've done my fair share of road trips for work. It's not glamorous, but I usually enjoy the quiet time on the road, catching up on podcasts, watching the scenery blur past. I'm a woman in my 30s, and I've never felt too worried about being on my own, at least not until this happened. A couple of weeks ago, I had to drive to a conference in another state. It was a long drive, about 6 hours across mostly empty highways. I planned to leave in the afternoon and get there by nightfall. Nothing out of the ordinary. I've done it plenty of times. It was the kind of drive where you hardly see any other cars for miles. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in this golden, almost eerie glow. I was deep into my favorite true crime podcast when I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. It had been back there for a while, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. I shrugged it off, focusing back on the road. But then, something about it started bothering me. The car wasn't just driving behind me. It seemed to be mirroring every move I made. I'd switch lanes, and they'd follow. I'd slow down, and they'd slow down too. My stomach tightened, but I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were nervous driving at night like I sometimes get. As the miles passed, my anxiety grew. I'd expected the car to take one of the exits I passed, but it stayed with me. I pushed my speed a bit, hoping they'd just move on, but they kept pace. Every time I glanced in the mirror, there they were. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, and the knot in my stomach tightened. It wasn't until I decided to take a random exit off the highway without signaling or anything that my fears were confirmed. They followed me, swerving into the exit lane at the last second, just like I had. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just in my head. Someone was definitely following me. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding. The first thought I had was to pull into a rest stop, somewhere with people around. I hoped if I did that, they'd get bored or realize I'd noticed them and leave me alone. After a few minutes of driving, I spotted a gas station and convenience store up ahead, so I pulled in. I parked and stayed in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching the other car out of the corner of my eye. They parked a few spaces away. I couldn't see much, just a silhouette behind the wheel, sitting there, not getting out. That's when the fear really set in. What now? Do I confront them? Call someone? My phone had only a couple of bars, and I doubted the police would rush out here for what could still just be a coincidence. I decided to go into the convenience store. There were people inside, and that made me feel a little safer. As I stepped out of my car, I couldn't help but glance at the other vehicle. No one moved. It was like they were waiting for me. Inside the store, I browsed the aisles, pretending to shop, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me. When I went up to the cashier to pay for a bottle of water, I casually asked if they'd noticed anything weird about the car parked outside. The cashier just shrugged, not really concerned. "People stop here all the time," they said. It didn't help. I took a deep breath before stepping back outside, and to my relief, the car was gone. For a second, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I convinced myself that they'd gotten bored and left, but just as I was about to get back into my car, something caught my eye, a shadow near the edge of the building. Someone was standing just out of sight. I froze. The parking lot was mostly dark now, lit only by the dim lights above the gas pumps. I couldn't make out who it was or what they were doing. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I rushed back to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone walking toward me. My heart was in my throat as I finally managed to unlock the door and get in. I locked the doors immediately and started the car, my eyes darting between the mirrors, searching for any movement. As I sped out of the parking lot, I checked the rearview mirror over and over, but the road behind me was empty. No sign of the car, no shadowy figure. I kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Eventually, the adrenaline started to wear off, and I began to convince myself that maybe it really was over. Maybe I was overreacting. That's when I saw the headlights behind me. At first, I thought it was just another car, but as they got closer, I realized it was the same one. My heart started pounding again. They were coming up fast, way too fast. Before I knew it, they were right behind me, tailgating me aggressively. I tried to speed up, but the road was narrow, and they stayed right on me, swerving closer like they were trying to run me off the road. Panicking, I veered onto a small side road, nearly losing control of the car. I zigzagged through unfamiliar roads, praying I could lose them. After a few minutes of reckless driving, the headlights disappeared. I pulled over, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. The silence was deafening. Just as I started to relax, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Nice try. See you soon." I haven't seen that car again, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting for another chance. Now, every time I get behind the wheel, I'm constantly checking my mirrors, always wondering if I'll see those headlights again. So yeah, if you ever notice a car behind you for too long, don't ignore it. Stay safe. I never imagined something like this would happen to me. But here I am, sharing my story, because I can't shake it. I live alone in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing remarkable, just the kind of place where you know your neighbors enough to say hello, but not much more. My life is pretty routine. Work during the day, come home, maybe play some games or watch Netflix until late. It's not exciting, but it's comfortable. A couple of weird things happened recently, though. One of my neighbors, a guy I barely talked to, moved out in the middle of the night. No warning, no goodbye. And I've been hearing these odd sounds at night, scraping noises, like something being dragged on the floor above me, even though that apartment's been empty for weeks. I brushed it off. You tell yourself it's just the building settling or your mind playing tricks. Then one night, as I was heading to bed, I noticed my front door was slightly ajar. I always lock it before I go to sleep, but there it was, open just a crack. I stood there, staring at it for a while, trying to remember if I had maybe forgotten. Eventually, I shrugged it off and locked it again. That's when things started to spiral. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by frantic, loud banging on my door. I jumped up, heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then a voice yelled, "Police! There's been an emergency! You need to evacuate now!" I froze. My first instinct was to look through the peephole, but I couldn't see much. Just some movement, but nothing clear. The voice outside kept shouting, saying there was some kind of emergency, but something didn't feel right. Why would the police come banging on my door in the middle of the night without any warning? I grabbed my phone and instead of opening the door, I called the local police department. When I explained the situation, the dispatcher sounded confused. "We haven't sent any officers to your address," they said. And there's no emergency in your area," the banging continued. I told the dispatcher I was sure someone was outside, claiming to be the police. They told me to stay inside, and they'd send a unit to check things out. The voice outside suddenly went quiet. I waited for what felt like forever, but there was no more noise. Slowly, I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. At the end of the street, a car was idling, headlights dim, but I couldn't make out any details. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat in the dark, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I couldn't bring myself to open the door or even move away from it. Instead, I checked the footage from my security camera, which covers the area right outside my door. There was nothing. No one had approached the door. No one had stood there. It made no sense. How could there be banging and a voice, but no one on camera? My mind started racing. Was someone messing with me? Were they trying to break in, maybe cut the camera feed somehow? I started to feel completely alone and exposed. I called a few neighbors, but no one picked up. I even sent a message to the building's group chat. No responses. I locked all the windows, double-checked every door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still outside, watching me. Then I heard another knock. This one wasn't loud or frantic. It was soft, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I turned off all the lights and sat near the door, holding my breath. That's when I heard it. Faint footsteps, slow and careful, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone fiddling with the lock. Panic gripped me. I could hear the metallic scraping as someone tried to pick the lock. I dialed the police again, this time barely able to keep my voice steady. "Someone's trying to break in," I whispered. The dispatcher assured me officers were on their way, but it felt like time was moving in slow motion. I grabbed the kitchen knife, hands shaking, and stood by the door. The scratching continued, then stopped for a second, before the knob jiggled violently. Then came a loud crack, like the door was about to give in. I stood frozen, knife in hand, waiting. Should I run? Should I try to fight? My mind raced with possibilities. Just as I was sure the door would fly open, everything went silent again. No more scratching, No banging, just dead silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear anything, any movement, any sign that someone was still there. That's when my phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor. "Did you get the note on your door too?" I didn't know what to think. After what felt like hours, the police finally arrived. They checked the area, looked over everything, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no suspicious individuals, and no vehicles matching the description of the car I saw. One of the officers said it was probably someone trying to scare me, maybe even a prank, but it didn't feel like a prank. My neighbor told me they'd received a similar note earlier in the night, telling them to evacuate, but they ignored it. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I went back inside, but I didn't sleep. Every little creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept checking the locks, convinced someone was still out there, waiting. As I was trying to calm down, I found a crumpled piece of paper that had been slipped under my door. It simply said, "This is just the beginning." I haven't slept properly since that night. I've changed the locks, added more cameras, but I can't shake the fear. I don't know if it was a prank or something more sinister, but every night I wait, knowing that I might never know for sure. The basement tenant. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or anything like that. I'm a pretty rational person, but what happened to me over the past few months has left me shaken. I guess I should start from the beginning. About a year ago, I inherited a small house from my parents. It's old, creaky, but cozy, and it's located in a quiet neighborhood. For a while, everything was fine, but as time passed, I realized the house needed some expensive repairs, so I decided to rent out the basement. It had a separate entrance, which meant I could maintain my privacy, and the extra money would help with bills. I posted an ad online, and after a few days, a man in his 50s responded. He seemed normal enough, quiet, polite, maybe a little reserved, but nothing alarming. He moved in, and for the most part, we barely saw each other. He kept to himself, which I was fine with. At first, it was okay. I'd hear the occasional noise from the basement, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. The house is old, so I figured it was just settling. Sometimes I caught odd smells, something metallic, almost, but I dismissed it. I told myself it was probably just the guy brewing his own beer or something. It's an old house, I kept thinking. No big deal. Then things got weird. One night, I woke up to this loud scraping noise coming from the basement. It was 3 a.m., and it sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I lay there for a while, debating whether to check it out. In the end, I convinced myself it was nothing serious, probably the tenant moving furniture around. I mean, why else would he be up at that hour? The next morning, I bumped into him as he was leaving. He didn't say much, but something felt off. He wouldn't meet my eyes, and his smile seemed forced. That's when I started noticing the smell again. Stronger this time, like something had gone bad. I asked him about it casually, and he brushed it off, saying he'd been brewing beer down there. I didn't know much about home brewing, so I let it go. But that night, the scraping noise came back, louder. This time, I got up and went to the basement door. I stood there, ear pressed against it, and I swear I heard something, like muffled voices. I knocked, but everything went silent. I felt stupid, standing there in the middle of the night, heart racing over something I couldn't even explain. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. That was when the real fear started creeping in. My house didn't feel like my own anymore. The next night I was awake again. The noises kept coming. This time it sounded like someone crying. Faint, but definitely human. I couldn't take it anymore. The next afternoon, when the tenant was out, I went down to the basement. It looked normal, for the most part, messy, but nothing strange. Then I saw it. A door under the stairs, locked. I didn't remember there being a door there when I first showed the place. I didn't want to be nosy, but something about it didn't sit right with me. When I confronted the tenant later, he shrugged it off, said it was just some old storage space. But the way he said it, his smile didn't reach his eyes. For the first time, I felt something close to fear. That night, after another loud crash from below, I called the police. They came and searched the place, but the tenant let them in without any hesitation. I watched from the top of the stairs as the officers poked around. They didn't find anything, just an old basement with nothing suspicious. I felt embarrassed, like I'd overreacted. The police left, and I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but the noises didn't stop. The next day, the tenant was gone. No warning, no note. His stuff was still there, but he was just gone. At first, I felt relieved, thinking maybe this was the end of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to investigate the locked door under the stairs. I forced the lock open. Behind it, there was a trapdoor. It led to a narrow tunnel beneath the house. I don't know why, but I climbed down. The air was damp, thick with that same metallic smell. The tunnel was barely wide enough for me to move through, and the deeper I went, the more I regretted coming down. Then I saw them. Rusted chains bolted to the walls, scratch marks on the dirt floor. My stomach twisted as I realized what had been happening here. Someone had been kept down here, maybe more than one person. I was about to turn back when I heard it, the scraping noise again right behind me. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to turn around, but I knew I had to. When I finally looked, there was nothing there, but I could feel it. Someone, or something, was close. I scrambled back to the surface, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely turn the key. I sat in the living room, trying to calm down, but then I heard it again. The same scraping noise. But this time, it was coming from upstairs. That's when it hit me. The tenant hadn't just been living in the basement. He'd been inside the house too, maybe for longer than I realized. I'm sitting here now, listening to footsteps overhead. I know I should run, but I can't move. I'm frozen, waiting for whatever is going to happen next. I don't think I'm alone anymore. The unfamiliar voice. I live alone in a small apartment in the city. It's nothing special, just a basic one-bedroom on the third floor of a fairly quiet building. Most nights I stay up late watching TV or working, and lately I've been feeling a bit off. Nothing major, just a lingering sense of unease that I can't shake. Maybe it's work stress or the fact that the city has been strangely silent at night. I don't get a lot of calls except from my sister, and we're pretty close. She's always been the one I could rely on. Recently, there have been a few odd things happening. My phone buzzed with no notifications, and sometimes I thought I saw shadows outside my window, but when I checked, no one was there. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. I mean, who wouldn't get a little jumpy living alone? But then I saw something strange. A call log on my phone. It was an unknown number. No voicemail. I don't even remember answering it. I figured it was just a mistake. Maybe some telemarketer. I didn't think much of it, at least not until that night. It was late, way past midnight. I was half asleep when my phone rang again. Unknown number. I thought about ignoring it, but for some reason I picked up. A man's voice greeted me. He was calm, too calm. "I have your sister," he said. For a moment, I didn't understand. I thought it was a joke or someone messing with me. But then he started giving me details about her. Things no stranger should know. Her address, her workplace. The fact that she always takes the same bus at 6:30 a.m. My stomach dropped. "If you want her back safe, "You'll follow my instructions," he said, "and don't even think about calling the police. You're running out of time." The line went dead. I tried to call my sister immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. I kept dialing, but there was no answer. What if this was real? I couldn't afford to risk it. I needed to do something. Without thinking, I threw on some clothes and rushed out into the street. It was eerily empty, like the city had been abandoned overnight. I followed the instructions the man had given me. He said to go to specific locations, all of them random spots around the city. I felt like I was being watched, but I didn't see anyone. Every dark alley, every corner made me more paranoid. Was he following me? Was this some kind of sick game? I kept trying to call my sister, over and over. Nothing, just voicemail. I was losing time, and with each unanswered call, my panic grew. I thought about calling the police, but his words echoed in my head. "Don't contact anyone or she gets hurt." What if he was serious? What if he was watching? Every place he sent me to felt like a dead end. An empty parking lot, a dark alley, a closed diner. I started to feel trapped, like there was no way out. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led in circles, wasting precious time. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop thinking about what he could be doing to my sister. Just as I was about to break and call the police, my phone rang again. This time, it was my sister's number. Relief washed over me as I answered, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" I almost shouted. "What? I'm at home," she said, confused. "What's going on?" She sounded fine, normal. She hadn't heard from anyone, hadn't noticed anything strange. For a second, I thought maybe it was all just a horrible prank. I felt my body relax, almost laughing at how ridiculous it all seemed. Maybe I had overreacted. Then the voice came back. Only this time, it was on my sister's phone. "Now I know where she is," the man said, his voice cold and emotionless. He hung up. My relief vanished. My blood turned to ice as the realization hit me. I had led him straight to her. I had been tricked, manipulated. The thought made me feel sick. I tried calling her back, but she didn't answer. I called again and again. Nothing. Panic overtook me. I had to get to her. I ran faster than I ever had, my mind racing through the worst possible scenarios. What if I was too late? What if he was already there? When I finally reached her apartment building, the door to her unit was slightly ajar. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I froze in front of the door, unsure if I should go inside or call for help. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. I felt paralyzed by fear, every second stretching out like hours. "Sarah?" I whispered, stepping toward the door. No response, just silence. My phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down. An unknown number again. My hand shook as I stared at the screen. Should I answer it? What if he was still watching? What if it was all part of his plan? My mind raced with questions, but I knew one thing for sure. I had no control over this situation. The phone kept vibrating, and I realized something terrible. I was trapped in his game. Whether I answered or not didn't matter anymore. He had me exactly where he wanted me. I finally pressed answer, but before I could say anything, the line went dead, and the screen went dark. That was the last call I ever received. The Lurking Photographer. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to write something like this, but I feel like I need to share my story. It's been eating away at me for months, and I don't know what else to do. Maybe getting it out there will help me make sense of it all. I used to live in a small apartment in a quiet part of the city. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. I worked from home, so most of my days were spent alone with my cat, enjoying the sunlight streaming through the large windows. Those windows were my favorite part of the apartment. They made everything feel open and bright, even when I was stuck inside all day. But after a while, I started feeling off. It's hard to explain. You know that sensation when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but I never saw anyone. Sometimes I'd catch a shadow moving outside or hear a faint creak in the hallway, but I always brushed it off. Maybe I was just imagining it. I told myself it was just because I was spending too much time alone. One night, though, things changed. I was closing up for the night, making sure all the lights were off before heading to bed. That's when I saw it, just a figure, standing across the street, barely visible in the darkness. They didn't move, didn't do anything. They were just there. I couldn't make out any details, and when I blinked, they were gone. It was so fast I convinced myself I was seeing things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I came home from running errands and found something in my mailbox. It was a small piece of paper with a single word, smile. That's it, just smile. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was some dumb prank, but when I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that figure standing outside, watching me. The idea of someone leaving me that note, it stuck with me. Things only got worse after that. The very next day, I saw someone standing outside my apartment again. This time, they had something in their hand, like a phone or a camera. I watched them from behind the curtains, and I swear they were taking pictures. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were there for me. My heart was pounding, but I was too scared to confront them. I slammed the curtains shut and stayed away from the windows for the rest of the night. That's when I decided to install new, thicker blinds. I thought it would help, that maybe I could finally get some peace of mind. But it didn't. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint but sharp, like the click of a camera shutter. I sat up, heart racing, and looked around. Nothing. The room was still. But when I looked out the window, I saw a figure moving quickly away, disappearing into the shadows. I was terrified. I called the building manager, begged him to check the security cameras, but when he did, there was nothing. No one was outside. No one had been there, at least according to the footage. I was losing it. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, always on edge, jumping at every little noise. I bought a set of security cameras and installed them around my apartment, hoping to catch whoever was doing this. But then, the emails started. They came from an anonymous address. The subject lines were always blank, and each email had just one attachment, a photo of me, sitting on my couch, cooking in the kitchen, reading in bed. The worst part? These weren't photos from outside my apartment. These were taken from inside. Someone had been inside my home. I couldn't breathe. How could someone have gotten in without me noticing? My building wasn't big, and there were no signs of a break-in. No one had keys except me. I called the police, but without any concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. They suggested it was a prank, or maybe even some weird coincidence, but I knew better. I wasn't safe. One morning, I woke up to find something new. Taped to my front door was a photograph of me sleeping. The angle was from the doorway, as if someone had stood there, watching me, while I slept. That was the breaking point. I packed a bag and left, crashing at a friend's place for a few days while I figured out what to do. The police came again, searched the apartment, but found nothing. No signs of entry, no fingerprints. It was as if no one had been there at all. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't live like that, always looking over my shoulder, wondering when they'd come back. So, I moved. I packed up everything, left the city, and started over somewhere new. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I thought if I could just disappear, I'd be safe. For a while, it worked. I found a new apartment in a different city and started settling in. I kept to myself, never opened the blinds, and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. The anxiety started to fade, and I convinced myself it was all behind me. Maybe it had been a prank. Maybe I'd imagined some of it. Weeks went by without incident, and I began to relax. Until today. This morning, I found a package outside my door. No return address, no name, just a plain brown envelope. Inside were more photos. Photos of me in my new apartment. Sitting at my desk, eating dinner, sleeping. And the last photo? A close-up of my face, taken through the window just a few days ago. I don't know how they found me, but they did. No matter where I go, they're always watching. The unfamiliar car. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood. It's one of those areas where nothing really happens. The kind of place where you know most of your neighbors, and if someone's car alarm goes off, everyone checks it out because it's such a rare event. I work late shifts, so I usually get home around 11 or midnight. By that time, the street is dead quiet. The houses are dark, the sidewalks are empty, and I'm often the only one out on the road. It started about a week ago. I came home like usual, but I noticed an old, beat-up sedan parked across the street from my house. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old car, but something about it seemed off. I hadn't seen it around before, and it looked out of place in my neighborhood. Still, I didn't think too much of it at the time. I figured it was just someone visiting one of my neighbors. The next night, the car was there again. And the night after that, same spot, no movement, windows dark. I started to feel uneasy, like it was there for a reason, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it belonged to someone who worked late like me, or maybe a neighbor's relative was staying over. But then, on the fourth night, I got home, and it was still there. I parked my car and sat for a minute staring at it. Something didn't feel right. By the end of the week, I was feeling on edge. I couldn't stop thinking about that car. It was always in the same place, and I never saw anyone get in or out of it. Every night, I'd come home and check the street to see if it was there. My mind started playing tricks on me. I thought I heard things. A car door closing softly just as I was drifting off to sleep, or the faint hum of an engine late at night. Then one night, I came around the corner, and I saw the car again. But this time, its headlights were on, pointing directly at my house. My stomach dropped. My pulse raced. Why were the lights on? Was someone inside, waiting for me? I pulled into my driveway, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The car's headlights stayed on, but the car itself didn't move. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at those lights. And then, out of nowhere, the engine revved. The car started moving, slowly driving down the street, as if it had been waiting for me to get home before it left. I didn't sleep that night. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see the car pull back up. Every little sound made me jump. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't help it. I knew that car didn't belong there. That night, it was back again. Only this time, it was parked right at the corner of my house. It felt closer, like it was watching me more directly now. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night was the worst. I lay in bed, every sound in the house amplified. I thought I heard footsteps outside my window, a car door closing, but when I looked, the street was empty. The next night, I was almost too scared to come home. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw the headlights flick on again. The car started moving, following me. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do, so I kept driving, taking random turns, trying to lose it. My hands were trembling. My heart was pounding. The car stayed with me, always a few cars back, but there. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. Someone's following me, I stammered. I'm not sure why, but they've been outside my house for days. The dispatcher asked for my location, but there wasn't much they could do right away. I kept driving, heart racing, my mind spinning with worst case scenarios. Was someone after me? What did they want? I felt like I was being hunted. I finally hit a red light. The car pulled up beside me. My heart stopped. The window rolled down, and a woman, middle-aged, looking confused, peered out at me. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I think I got lost following my GPS. You kept making all these weird turns, and I got totally turned around." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. For a moment, I didn't believe her. I was so sure someone had been watching me, following me. But she seemed genuinely lost. "I was trying to find a friend's house," she said, holding up her phone to show me the GPS. "I'm really sorry if I scared you." I didn't know what to say. I sat there, frozen, as she gave a small, apologetic wave and drove off when the light turned green. I pulled over at the nearest gas station, my hands still shaking. I couldn't believe it. For days I had been terrified, sure someone was stalking me, and it had just been a lost driver. But even though it was over, the fear didn't leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe I had overreacted, let my fear get the best of me. But that nagging feeling stayed with me. I stayed at the gas station for a while, trying to calm down. When I finally drove home, the car was gone, but my nerves weren't. The house felt too quiet. That night, lying in bed, I tried to convince myself it was over. But every creak in the house, every distant sound made my heart race. The fear still lingered. The next morning, I looked out the window expecting to see that old sedan again, but it wasn't there. Even so, the dread didn't leave. It still feels like something's watching me, waiting, even though the car hasn't returned. Maybe it's all in my head. Or maybe it's just waiting for the right moment. It started out as a normal day. I went to my usual grocery store after work, a small local place not far from my apartment. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was thinking about dinner and debating whether to try a new recipe or stick with something quick. I was tired, and honestly, my mind wasn't entirely there, just the usual mundane end-of-day fatigue. I moved from aisle to aisle, picking up things without paying much attention, but I noticed this guy a few times. At first, it didn't mean anything. Grocery stores are busy, and people tend to end up in the same aisles, right? But something felt off. He seemed to always be a little too close. Like, standing in the same aisle when I turned the corner, then moving closer every time I reached for something on the shelf. I remember locking eyes with him for a second. He quickly looked away, and I brushed it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I finished shopping and headed toward the checkout. As I was leaving, I saw him again, just a few feet behind me, walking out of the store. A little chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Coincidences happen. Maybe we were both leaving at the same time by chance. I loaded my groceries into my car and started driving home. I took my usual route, through a couple of quiet neighborhoods, past the park, nothing strange. But about 5 minutes in, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a car. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Then I looked again. It was the guy from the grocery store. That same unsettling feeling crept up, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. He could live nearby, or maybe he was just heading in the same direction. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. After a few more minutes, he was still there, following me through every turn. My heart started racing. I took a random left turn into a residential street I never drive down just to see if he'd keep following. He did. My stomach dropped. There was no way this was just a coincidence anymore. I turned again, this time into a small parking lot. He followed. It hit me all at once. I was being followed. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to drive home, but I knew that wasn't an option. If I did, he would know where I lived. I was trapped. My mind was racing. Should I call the police? But what would I even say? That some guy was driving behind me? He hadn't done anything illegal. I pulled into a well-lit gas station, hoping that being in public would scare him off. But he didn't leave. His car parked across from mine, and he just sat there. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't want to get out of the car. I thought about confronting him, but what if I was wrong? What if this was all in my head? He could easily just say he was waiting for someone, or maybe he'd deny everything. I felt so vulnerable, sitting in my car, watching him watch me. I debated calling someone, but I didn't want to sound crazy. I was completely stuck in my own head, and that's when my phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen. A text from an unknown number. "Why are you running?" I froze. My blood turned to ice. How did he get my number? I hadn't even seen him get out of his car, but he was texting me. I looked up, and he was just sitting there, staring at his phone, occasionally glancing in my direction. The dread built up in my chest. This wasn't just some random guy. He had been watching me, tracking me. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped out of the lot, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I had no idea where I was going. I just needed to get away. The fear had taken over, and I couldn't think straight. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Another text. "You can't hide." I drove in circles for what felt like hours, through random streets and back roads, hoping to lose him. Every car that pulled up behind me made me panic. I started to think maybe he had something on my car, some way of tracking me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see him at every turn. Finally, I pulled into a police station parking lot. It was the only place I could think of where I might be safe. I sat there, shaking, trying to calm down. His car wasn't in sight anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still waiting. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. The message was short. "Nice try. I'll see you soon." I didn't go into the station. I don't know why, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the thought that no one would believe me, or maybe I was just too scared to explain everything. I stayed there for a while, my body trembling, wondering if it was really over. It wasn't. The text didn't stop. I changed my number. I even moved to a new apartment across town. But somehow, he always found a way to reach me. Every time I thought it was over, I'd get another message, always vague, but threatening enough to keep me on edge. I don't know how long I can keep living like this, never taking the same route home, always watching my back, avoiding certain places. He hasn't shown up again in person, but the fear is still there. I'm constantly waiting for the day when he does. Just as I'm typing this out, my phone buzzes again. Another message from an unknown number. "I'll see you soon." I've always had a history of sleepwalking. It's something that started when I was a kid and happened off and on until my teens. It's never been a big deal, though. At least, not until recently. I'm in my early 30s now, living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I work from home, spend my evenings watching Netflix or scrolling through my phone. Nothing too exciting. For a long time, my sleepwalking episodes seemed to have stopped, but over the past few weeks, I've noticed small, unsettling changes. I'd wake up with objects out of place, a chair pushed back from the table, my bedroom door open when I swear I closed it the night before. At first, I brushed it off, thinking I'd just forgotten things. But there was this lingering feeling that something was off. One morning, I woke up in front of my apartment door, sitting there like I'd been ready to leave in the middle of the night. That rattled me a bit. But again, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd just had a stressful day and moved around in my sleep. I didn't think much more about it. Then one night, after staying up late working, I was feeling particularly restless. I took a sleep aid, hoping it would help me get a full night's sleep. It didn't. I woke up on a cold, hard floor in complete darkness. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I sat up, groggy and disoriented, it hit me. This wasn't my room. I wasn't in my apartment. The panic came fast. I tried to get my bearings, but nothing around me was familiar. It was too dark to make out details, but the air felt different, the floor beneath me cold and rough. My heart raced as I listened for any sound. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. I froze. The footsteps were faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere nearby. I had no idea where I was, and now it was clear I wasn't alone. My first instinct was to get up and find a way out, but a wave of dread washed over me. What if whoever lived here found me? I couldn't explain why I was there, and I wasn't sure I even knew myself. Sleepwalking? Could I have walked into someone else's home? I pushed myself off the floor, my hands shaking. Slowly, I moved toward what I hoped was a door. My hands felt along the walls, and that's when I noticed them. Pictures. I squinted, trying to make out the faces. They weren't mine. A family, kids, parents, none of them familiar. My stomach dropped. I was definitely in a stranger's home. The panic made me want to bolt, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Every step felt like it could get me caught. I moved down what seemed to be a hallway, trying to find the exit, but nothing looked right. The house felt like a maze, and every time I thought I was getting closer to leaving, I'd find myself in another unfamiliar room. I tried to calm down, but my mind kept racing. How far had I sleepwalked? How had I even gotten inside? Did I break in? The footsteps grew louder, closer. I ducked into the first space I could find. A closet, maybe? I wasn't sure. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my body tensed, bracing for the door to swing open. I could hear the footsteps right outside now, and then a voice. Low, muttering something I couldn't make out. It was too quiet, but it sounded like someone was talking, or maybe they were on the phone. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked with fear. But the door didn't open. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. I let out a shaky breath, my hands still trembling. This was my chance. I stepped out, moving as quietly as I could. I found another hallway, and finally what looked like the front door. I rushed toward it, reaching for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Locked. Panic surged through me again. I fumbled with the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it again, the voice, clearer now, and closer. I spun around, heart pounding in my throat, but there was no one there. My mind was spinning out of control. I ran for what I thought might be a back door. My hands scrambled over the lock, and with a click, the door swung open. I stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. For a moment, I was so relieved to be out of that house that I didn't notice it right away. But as I looked around, the panic started to creep back in. I wasn't outside my apartment. I was in an unfamiliar neighborhood, miles from home. My legs felt weak as I walked down a dimly lit street, my mind racing. How had I ended up here? I had no phone, no wallet, nothing. The fear of what had just happened was still fresh, but now there was a deep, unsettling confusion on top of it. I had no idea where I was or how to get home. I wandered for what felt like hours, too scared to knock on anyone's door. Eventually, I saw a main road and flagged down a car. The driver looked at me strangely, but he pulled over. As I got into the car, he glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "I've seen you here before," he said. I didn't respond. I was too tired, too freaked out to process it. The drive was silent, and when we finally reached my apartment, I could barely thank him before stumbling out of the car. But as I stood outside my building, a chilling realization crept in. This wasn't the first time. For weeks, I'd been waking up feeling off, noticing things out of place in my apartment. At the time, I brushed it off. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that something worse had been happening, something I hadn't been ready to confront, and I wasn't sure it was over. The neighbor's window. I moved into my little house about 6 months ago after a bad breakup. It's a quiet suburban neighborhood, perfect for someone like me who needed peace. I work from home, so my routine is pretty much the same every day. Work during the day, and in the evening, I either go for a walk or relax with a book. The house across from mine belongs to Mr. Johnson, an older man who had been friendly enough when we met. A few weeks ago, he told me he was going out of town for a month to visit family. I didn't think much of it. He's retired, and it's not uncommon for him to take long trips. One night, as I was sipping tea and looking out my window, I saw something that didn't make sense. There was movement in Mr. Johnson's window, just a slight flicker behind the curtains. It was late, and I knew no one should be there. At first, I thought it might have been headlights from a passing car, or maybe just a shadow. I shrugged it off, thinking I was being paranoid. But as I sat back down, the feeling stuck with me. Something felt off. The next night, I found myself glancing out the window again. That's when I saw it. Clearer this time. A figure, just a dark outline, pacing back and forth behind Mr. Johnson's curtains. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way anyone should be in that house. I stared, hoping it was my imagination, but the figure kept moving, stopping every so often as if looking out. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe there was a logical explanation, like a family member had come by to check on the place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The following night, I kept watching the house, and the figure returned. This time, they stayed still for longer, just standing there. It creeped me out enough that I finally called the non-emergency police line. 2 officers came by and did a quick check. They told me they didn't find anything. The doors were locked, and the place was secure. Probably just a shadow or reflection, one of them said. I wanted to believe them, but as soon as they left, the figure was back in the window, right where it had been before. It was watching me. Over the next few nights, I couldn't stop myself from looking at that window. Every time I looked, the figure was there, sometimes moving, sometimes just standing. I became obsessed. I hardly slept, just waiting for it to appear again. I asked a few neighbors if they'd noticed anything strange, but most of them laughed it off. One neighbor admitted she saw something odd a couple of times, but thought it was just a trick of the light. No one else seemed concerned. Then, one night, I was lying in bed when I heard a noise from my hallway, a soft creak, like someone stepping on a floorboard. My heart raced. I got up slowly, listening for more sounds, but the house was quiet. Still, I checked every lock, every door, every window. My paranoia had taken over. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in Mr. Johnson's house might be watching me too. Maybe they'd come for me next. I started locking my bedroom door at night. I'd lie there, wide awake, imagining footsteps outside my door. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. And then, one night, I woke up around 3 a.m. and felt something pull me toward the window. I looked out, and there they were. The figure wasn't in Mr. Johnson's window this time. They were standing at the edge of my yard, staring directly at my house. That was it. I grabbed my phone and called the police again. I told them someone was in my yard, watching me, possibly trying to break in. My hands were shaking as I spoke. When the police arrived, they searched my yard and the street, but found nothing. They told me again that everything was fine, but I didn't believe them. As soon as they left, I saw the figure again, now back in Mimi Johnson's window, still watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's house, too scared to stay another night. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every noise, every creak had me jumping. I kept thinking about that figure and what they might do next. Then, around 4 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Nice view from the window, isn't it? I felt sick. How did they get my number? I didn't go back home the next day. Instead, I returned a couple of days later, exhausted and terrified. I locked myself in, double-checking every window and door. I didn't see the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even during the day, I'd catch myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see them. I decided to move. I couldn't live in that house anymore. While I was packing, my phone buzzed again. I froze. It was another message from the same number. You can't hide. I left the house a week later, but the fear stayed with me. Even in my new place, every time I look out a window, I expect to see that shadow. I still don't know who they were or what they wanted. Maybe I never will. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I see a shadow moving in the distance. And every time, I wonder if it's them, watching me, waiting for me to look away. I've recently moved to a new city, started a new job, and, well, I'm trying to declutter. The new place is smaller than my old apartment, and I had this old couch that I didn't need anymore. It had been sitting in my garage for weeks, taking up space. Finally, I decided to list it on one of those classified ad sites. The process was easy enough. I've used these sites before, and they've always worked out fine. After a couple of messages back and forth, I found a buyer who seemed interested. They didn't say much, though, which in hindsight should have raised a red flag. They insisted we meet halfway, in a parking lot of some strip mall I wasn't familiar with. It was getting late, but I wanted to get rid of the couch, so I agreed. I didn't think much of it at the time, just one more thing to cross off my to-do list. Looking back now, the fact that they didn't give much information and pushed for a late-night meet should have tipped me off, but I brushed it off. I was eager to make the sale and move on. I arrived at the parking lot a little early. It was more isolated than I had imagined. Only a couple of flickering streetlights and empty spaces as far as I could see. A sense of unease crept in as I parked my car. Still, I figured the buyer would be there soon, and I could get it over with. 15 minutes passed. No sign of anyone. I started scrolling through my phone to pass the time when I noticed an unread message from the buyer. Running a bit late, sorry. Be there soon. It was fine, I thought. But as soon as I put my phone down, another car pulled in from the far end of the lot. It wasn't the buyer's car, it wasn't even close. I glanced at it and realized there were two people inside, but they didn't get out. They just parked there and stayed in the car. At that point, I started feeling a little uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't help but keep an eye on that car. Why weren't they leaving or approaching me? I debated driving away, but I didn't want to look paranoid. After all, maybe they were just waiting for someone like I was. Then, another car arrived. This one parked farther away, and no one got out either. My anxiety spiked, and I started to second guess why I was there in the first place. It was late. It was dark. I was alone. More cars started to trickle into the parking lot. Each one parked in different corners, none of them too close, but none of them leaving either. I could feel my heart racing. I kept telling myself this was just a coincidence, that I was imagining things. Maybe this was a spot where people hung out in their cars. But with each glance, I saw the cars weren't moving. They were just there, idling, some with headlights on, some without. Suddenly, one of the cars flashed its headlights at me. I froze. Was that meant for me? I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat there, pretending I didn't see it. Moments later, the car pulled away slowly, disappearing into the distance. I tried calling the buyer, but the call went straight to voicemail. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I stayed, torn between feeling foolish and thinking this was all in my head. Then, another car pulled up behind mine, close enough that it felt like they were blocking me in. I could feel my chest tightening. The windows of all the cars were tinted or turned away, so I couldn't see who was inside. It felt like eyes were on me from every direction. Just when I made up my mind to leave, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the buyer. Almost there, pulling in now. Sorry for the delay. I exhaled, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was overreacting. But then, the car that pulled in wasn't what I expected. A rusted old sedan rolled in and parked a few spaces away. The headlights cut off, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the buyer stepped out. A man who seemed normal enough, but something about the way he moved was off. His hands were shaking as he approached me, offering a quick apology for the confusion. "I'm so sorry I'm late," he said, looking over his shoulder as if someone was watching. "I had some car trouble." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I didn't. I couldn't. The guy seemed apologetic, almost desperate to explain away the weirdness. "The other cars aren't with me," he added, waving a hand dismissively. "I don't know what they're doing here. Probably just random people." That didn't reassure me. I tried to keep my face neutral, but inside I was spiraling. Was he telling the truth? Why were all these cars here? I glanced around and realized we were surrounded. Every direction I looked, there was another car just sitting there. As I was about to tell him I wanted to leave, another car pulled in. This one seemed connected to the buyer. He looked over at the new arrival, his face tense, then back at me. We loaded the couch into his car quickly. The whole time, my heart was racing, but nothing happened. The other cars didn't move. The buyer thanked me, his demeanor more relaxed now, but I was still on edge, glancing over at the other cars, wondering if I was going to make it out of there. As he drove off, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. But that feeling didn't last long. One of the other cars pulled out and followed him. I watched as they disappeared together down the road. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Had I imagined it all, or was I narrowly avoiding something terrible? I kept replaying the night in my head, wondering if the buyer had lied about the other cars. It was probably nothing, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. I decided I'm never using classified ads again. Even now, I still wonder if I was being watched that night, and I don't know if I'll ever get an answer. I'm a college student. Between classes, a part-time job, and endless assignments, my days are packed. Most nights I end up at the library, staying late to study. It's become a routine. After dinner, I head to the library, find my usual spot, and work until closing. The place feels familiar, almost comforting during the day, but after dark, it's different. The quiet feels heavier. The fluorescent lights seem dimmer, and sometimes I get the odd feeling that someone's watching me. It's probably just exhaustion. I spend so much time here that my mind starts playing tricks. But there was this one time, around 11 p.m., when I heard a chair scraping across the floor from the far end of the library. I looked up, but no one was there. I told myself it was nothing, just someone leaving quietly. Still, I started noticing this guy, an older man, probably in his 50s. He always sat in the same spot, a few tables away, occasionally glancing in my direction. I tried not to think much of it. One night, I arrived later than usual, and the library was emptier. The man was there, like always, sitting in his corner. But this time, his eyes seemed to linger on me longer. It wasn't like he was staring, more like he kept looking at me every few minutes. I felt uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I had work to do, and I wasn't about to let some stranger distract me. As the night went on, I noticed him getting up more frequently. He'd wander through the aisles, stopping near my table for a few seconds before heading back to his seat. By now, my anxiety was growing, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just restless. Near closing time, most people had left, and it was just the two of us. That's when he walked over and stood by my table. "You're here a lot, aren't you?" he said, his tone casual but off somehow. "Do you usually stay this late?" I forced a smile, muttering something vague as I packed my things. He didn't do anything overtly threatening, but his presence felt wrong. I made some excuse about needing to leave, and as I hurried out, I glanced back through the window. He was still watching me, unmoving. That image stuck with me all night. The next day, I tried to rationalize the whole thing. Maybe he was just lonely. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. Still, I decided not to stay so late in the future. I even skipped a couple of my usual library visits, hoping he'd forget about me. But a few days later, as I walked to class, I saw him again, this time standing across the street. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking down at his phone. But I knew. It wasn't a coincidence. Still, I told myself it had to be. Maybe he just lived nearby. Except it kept happening. I started seeing him in other places, outside the coffee shop I always go to, walking past my building. He was never close enough to confront, but always close enough to notice. I told a couple of friends, but they just brushed it off. "Maybe he's on the same schedule as you," one of them said, but I knew better. One afternoon, when I saw him standing outside my apartment building, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked straight up to him, asked him why he was following me. He didn't say anything, just gave me this faint smile and walked away. The silence was worse than anything he could have said. That night, after another late study session, I saw him again. He was standing by the library exit, smoking a cigarette, just watching. Panic hit me hard. I left through a side door, walking a different route home, checking behind me every few seconds. By the time I got to my apartment, I was shaking. I started locking my door multiple times, checking it every night before bed. But the fear didn't go away. I was losing sleep, my grades were slipping, and the anxiety was consuming me. Then I found a note slipped under my door. "See you tomorrow." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to go to the police, but what could I say? He hadn't done anything illegal. I was terrified they wouldn't believe me. So instead, I stayed with a friend for the night, hoping it would give me time to figure things out. The next day, I went home, thinking maybe I'd overreacted. But when I unlocked the door, I froze. There was a single dirty shoe print on the carpet, leading from the front door to my bedroom. Nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. But I knew what it meant. He had been inside. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. I couldn't. I stayed with friends, trying to explain what had happened without sounding paranoid. No one understood why I was so scared, but I knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, waiting for the right moment. The man disappeared for a while after that, but the fear didn't leave. I kept expecting to see him around every corner, outside every window. And then yesterday, I found another note under my door. "You're not that hard to find." I still haven't gone to the police. Maybe I'm too scared they'll dismiss me. Or maybe it's something deeper. He hasn't shown up again, but I know it's only a matter of time. I've changed my routine, stopped going to the library at night, but I can't shake the feeling that he's always there, lurking somewhere. I've thought about leaving town, but I know it won't matter. He'll find me. He always does. I don't know when, but I know he'll be back. I wasn't going to post this, but I've been thinking about it for days, and I can't shake the feeling that something's still wrong. Maybe someone here will have some advice, or at least help me make sense of it all. A few weeks ago, I went out with some friends. It was a typical Saturday night. We hit a few bars, took lots of photos, the usual. We were at this crowded place downtown, nothing special, just a night out. I felt pretty good, but I remember this one moment where I felt watched. I didn't think much of it at the time. Crowded bar, lots of people. It's easy to feel paranoid in those situations, right? I shrugged it off and kept having fun. The night ended like any other. I went home, and the next day, I did what I usually do. Scrolled through the photos on my phone, laughing at the ones where we looked ridiculous. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. In one of the photos, there was a man standing behind us. He wasn't part of our group, but he was staring directly at me. At first, I thought it was just a random guy, someone who got caught in the background. But as I kept scrolling through the photos, he was in more of them, always in the background, always staring. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence. Maybe he was looking at something behind me. Maybe I was being paranoid. But the more I looked, the more unsettled I felt. He was there in almost every photo we took at that bar, standing a few feet away in each one. And his expression, it wasn't casual or distracted. It was cold, focused, like he was watching me. I texted my friends, asking if they remembered seeing him. None of them did. They thought I was overreacting, that maybe he was just some drunk guy at the bar. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't remember him being there at all. And now, looking at the photos, it was obvious that he had been following us the entire night. The worst part? In the last photo, he was much closer, just a few feet behind me, staring directly at the camera. I don't remember seeing him that close at any point. I started to panic. I checked the timestamps on the photos, trying to piece together when this happened. We had left the bar shortly after that last picture was taken, and I had walked home alone. Why didn't I notice him? How close had he been to me that whole time? I locked my doors and sat down, trying to calm myself. I considered going to the police, but what was I going to say? Hey, there's this guy in my photos who I don't remember seeing. That's not exactly a crime. Nothing had actually happened, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. But the thought of him following me all night made my skin crawl. I texted my friends again, asking them to check their photos or social media to see if they caught him in any of their pictures. None of them had anything. I tried to put it out of my mind. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. But then, something happened that I can't explain. That night, I got a notification from my home security app, motion detected near my window. My heart dropped. I opened the app, and there he was. The same man from the photo standing outside my apartment window, staring in. His face wasn't fully visible, but I knew it was him. My blood went cold. I just stared at the screen, frozen. What was I supposed to do? Should I call the police? Was he trying to break in? He didn't move, just stood there, staring. The seconds dragged on like hours. My phone started buzzing. It was one of my friends calling to check on me. I could barely speak. I was so terrified. I managed to tell them what was happening, and they told me to call the police. But before I could even dial, the man disappeared from the camera feed. I ran to the window, but there was no sign of him. My mind was racing. Was he still out there? Was he waiting for me to open the door? I didn't know what to do. My friend stayed on the phone with me, trying to calm me down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby, watching. Then, there was a knock at the door. I nearly screamed. My whole body went numb. I slowly crept toward the door, every step filled with dread. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. No one was there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I went back to my phone, checking the security feed again. But everything was dark. I couldn't see anything clearly. Maybe he was gone. Maybe he never meant to hurt me. But I couldn't convince myself that it was over. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from my friend, telling me they were on their way over to check on me. I felt a small wave of relief, but it didn't last long. The silence in my apartment felt heavy, and every little creak made me jump. I kept thinking I heard something, like a faint noise coming from inside the apartment. Since that night, I haven't seen him again, but the fear hasn't gone away. I don't know why he was following me or what he wanted, but every time I walk outside, I feel like I'm being watched. It's like a shadow that follows me, always just out of sight. I'm thinking about moving, but I'm not sure it'll help. The worst part is not knowing. Why was he there? What did he want? I don't have any answers, and that's what scares me the most. I didn't even want to mention this, but a few days ago, I found a new photo on my phone. I don't remember taking it. It's a picture of me, sleeping in my bed.